I see when Prince Edward Island, if you ask someone how are you, they actually answer. So I like some, how are you this morning? Good, okay, let's bring you alive. First I need to apologize because it takes me 24 hours to get here and 3 flights. And of course, flights are full of people who are ill. So I'm fairly ill. So I apologize for sneezing, coughing. I'm going to need to rehydrate. But bear with me, I think we'll be fine. I'd like to thank the organizer for this opportunity to be the first speaker and to kick off this 2-day event. And I hope it's going to trigger lots of conversations amongst yourself, with me as well, with all of the speakers, and that we can really have a rich dialogue for these 2 days. I really like the tone and the theme of the conference this year. I was here last year. I did a brief talk, and I'd say my talk was dissonant with the rest of the... everyone was saying, this is great, we're doing well, and my talk was really saying, well, actually, we've got major problems, and it's not going as well as it is. So this time, I feel totally congenial in the landscape. We are going to be talking about problems for the whole 2 days, so I should fit in fine. On the topic of UDL format, it's always a bit strange to be talking at a UDL conference and to be doing, again, the sort of sage on the stage. So, you know, we have 45 minutes together. We don't have that much time to break this. I will try and make it as interactive as possible. What I would like to encourage you is to continue the conversation through lunch so that it does become a UDL exercise and it's not just about listening to someone talk from a stage for 45 minutes. Also use the Twitter hashtag because I will be answering all day and tomorrow. So if you don't have time to ask a question, but you want those conversations to carry on, do please use a hashtag and I'll certainly keep an eye on it all day. So we'll make a start. We're together for about 45 minutes and we'll have 10 minutes for questions at the end, just to give you an idea. I just want to give you a tiny little insight into my life because I think it's going to be important for the talk. I've really multiple perspectives on UDL, and I think this is what makes it sort of pertinent today in the sort of discussions that we're going to have. So I worked in education for a long time as a teacher, as a principal for 20 years. My background is social emotional behavior difficulties, and I was always really destined, I also myself as doing the PhD and eventually becoming faculty and training teachers in doing that. But at the same time, during my PhD for 4 years, I was one of those stubborn people who refused to give up work, so I carried on working. And I took on the job as accessibility manager, basically. I was the director of the Office for Students with Disabilities at McGill, a campus that has 1,800 users of the service accessibility services. And when I came into that job, starting the PhD in 2011, I was given a job of trying to roll out UDL across campus. So I provide this multiple perspective. I see myself continuing life in those 2 roles between faculty and between accessibility. And we'll have a chance to talk about this because I think it will be at the heart of the conversation today. And it's certainly a phenomenological perspective which I explore more and more in my work and in my writing because I think it is interesting to see how we are sitting on different sides of the barrier and we have to work at eroding those fences. Objectives for today, what I'd like to have as a plan for the talk, I'd like to talk about 2 major issues. So, I was very kindly introduced as presenting one elephant, but I would say almost it's like, 2 elephants there. The first one will be talking about the role of accessibility units in the UDL implementation and maybe the ambivalent role that they have. So I'm going to try and tackle some of these issues. The second one will be the notion of silo and territoriality in UDL rollout on campuses. So once we've established those 2 big problems, I'll try to offer some solutions to give you some hope as we live today that it's not all dark and there are some solutions out there. What I'd like to do is first to identify the need. Whenever I do a talk like this on UDL, I stopped myself and I said, we can't even start delivering a talk. I can't even start talking to you unless you feel there's a need for someone to be talking about this. So I'm going to invite you on an interactive exercise. And because I'm skipping the slides, but I'm going to, okay, for about 5 minutes to get you talking, I would like you to explore these questions with the person sitting next to you, behind you, across from you. So 3 questions for you. Who has ownership of UDL on your campus? And who is tasked with moving it forward as an agenda? The second question, how good is that stakeholder at collaborating with others, other departments and other units? And the last one is, how quickly is UDL implementation moving across your campus? So please interact, 5 minutes, make lots of noise, and then we'll try and gauge the room and see how we're doing with these three questions. I apologize for having to end those conversations, but at least we've had a little bit of interactive UDL format there, so at least it's good. Okay, so I can't ask for contributions from the room at this stage. We don't yet have a microphone. We will have the questions, but I would like to gauge the room a little bit. So if you can bear with me, we'll try and do this exercise. Just raise your hand if you answer yes to the question. So who feels that the institution is receptive to UDL? And look at the room, because this isn't for me, it's for you. So let's see how many hands are raised. Okay, so it's not too bad. We've got at least a third there where the institution is receptive. Who feels the institution has a strategic plan in place when it comes to UDL? I think we have, 10 hands raised maybe. All right, it's getting tough. Who feels the institution has thought and discussed ownership, i.e. which unit or department will take responsibility for UDL? 4, 6, 7 hands? Okay. So, and the last one, who feels they have clarity within the institution when it comes to UDL in the future? 1 hand, good, at least. Please, give us some hope. So, I think at this stage, we have a need, right? We have a need to have this conversation, and we have a need for these 2 days of conversations. Because the picture isn't clear, and there's a lot of pieces that we're missing. So hopefully in this talk, in the next 40 minutes now, we will try and unpack some of these questions so that we can try and find solutions in the 2 days that follow. So the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is disability service providers. And I've had the perfect introduction since there's been the launch of this Irish policy document. So I'll be drawing from that and encourage you to think about the ambivalent status of disability service provider within UDL implementation. Now, I'd like to first say that whatever I'm going to say in the next slides is to be thought-provoking. I have much love for accessibility stuff. I was one for 4 years. So I'm not saying it as criticism, but I think it is time for us, and even if this room you are disability service providers, it is time for us to start looking at ourselves from a systemic point of view, looking at our philosophy ethos, and asking some really important questions, because otherwise we might just be caught, in this sort of in this phenomenon where we're not moving forward. We're just, pedaling on empty. So here are some of the contradictions which I identify in the role of accessibility providers within UDL. And again, I speak from having had that role for 4 years, so it's not a criticism, it's really heartfelt. First, we have a really shaky commitment because of funding models. And I'm speaking to you from a Canadian perspective, but it's the same in the States, same in most European countries. It is very hard as a disability service provider to move UDL forward when our funding models and the funding models that we use within those units actually recognize a medical model approach and don't recognize a UDL model approach. Okay, so we need to do something about the funding. And I think governments all over the world are saying, the funding for students with disability isn't working. But I think that's a key question, right? If it's no longer working, then how is that work going to be funded? How is it going to work? Because it can't go through this model of, depending on how many heads you have in an accessibility office, you get that much of an envelope. The funding model, more importantly, is diagnostic, right? So we are still caught in this difficult thing where we are sending letters to instructors saying you have a student in your classroom who has a disability, has an impairment. We're asking students to add themselves. We are coding. We are doing all these things. This is not compatible with UDL. And as long as we remain stuck in these procedures, we will not be able to move UDL forward. And the funding model also depends on the students' reliance on student services. And this is problematic. So I'd like to give you a little bit of an anecdote there so you can understand what I mean by that. When I started working at McGill in the accessibility service, we were doing a sort of audit and looking at better, more UDL ways of providing services. And I said, why don't we offer Skype appointments to our students? For many, many reasons, they don't want to come in, they don't have the time, they have a complex life. Why aren't we using Skype to register students, provide services, do all this? I had huge resistance. And I had the sort of arguments where people said, but they have to come in. They have to come and see us. It's good for them to come and see us. So we are really deeply ingrained, because we've been doing this for 40 years as a professional body. We've convinced ourselves that these students need to depend on us, right? And that's not what UDL is about. UDL is actually about them navigating the campus in an autonomous way without having to come through us as gatekeepers. When I did eventually sort of force my way through and start Skype appointment, by the way, out of an 1,800 student body service user population, a third of those overnight moved on to Skype as opposed to having to come into the office and meet someone, all right? But when I did force this, I had people who left the service, right? I had people who resigned because they said, no, I don't want to do this in this way. I want to be the gatekeeper. I want people to come and see me. I want them to have these conversations. That's what I mean by this over-reliance on the fact that students need us. Fear of sustainability. So the policy document talks about the sustainability of service provision. And we're all faced with this, right? Because we see the exploding numbers, and we can basically not carry on doing what we're doing at the moment. We don't have enough staff to carry on with this model. So this is the deep sustainability issue. But it's not the only sustainability issue. I think as soon as you start talking about UDL, there's a fair number of people within disability service provision who are afraid, and they ask themselves this question: are we working ourselves out of a job? And I think even when we don't admit it, we have to think that this is the underlying fear that is in many services. So we're going to have to think, how can we reassure accessibility service personnel that they will have a new role, that they will have something else to do in this future? So I'm just going to have a bit. I talked there about deeply rooted adherence to medical model. And I think that's because of our training, because of the last 40 years of disability service provision, because of the kind of backgrounds we have, we often talk about UDL, but we're still very reliant on the medical model as a model, right? We're not doing a switch to social model. We're still stuck there. So this is a problem too. And background and training, I've already discussed this. We come from, in the disability service provision, we come from backgrounds that are more rooted on medical model than on a pedagogical perspective on UDL. And this is really where we need to go. We need to actually change that and move over. We also, I think, as a field, have an over-reliance on the notion of help. Now, I might be really challenging here, but I think we have to ask ourselves to what extent we want to be helpers. And this goes back to the notion of dependence. It's a hard question. When I did a UD audit with my team, we banned the word help. And try this in your offices if you're accessibility managers. It's actually very difficult because it starts with how can we help you today? So you've got to reframe that and the whole service provision that follows. So it's a great exercise and try it. And that really highlights to you to what extent we've anchored in this almost need. And that's, we've got to look inside. It's a need that we have, right, to be helping people. But that, again, isn't compatible with the UDL model. Right? If we actually want a UDL model, we'd rather not have to help students because they are independently and autonomously navigating a campus and a lecture hall without having to come and see us. Complex issues around the conceptualization of service provision. I think this is even wider than accessibility services. If you look around the world, student services are growing and growing and growing. And we don't really ask ourselves, well, where does this stop, right? And there's an interesting thing, which is almost parasitic, right, in this relationship between student services and the campus. I see this in mental health, for example. When I've left McGill now 3 years ago, we have a psychiatric, it's not called psychiatric, but it literally is. So we have a mental health service, which is pretty much a psychiatric unit within a university, which has grown and grown and grown and grown. So instead of looking at the problems, why do we have mental health issues on a campus and actually going to the causes of this, we just add to the services, add to the services, add to the services. And I think in accessibility it's the same thing, right? It's what we've just discussed. Instead of targeting lecturers, people who design and saying, okay, let's do something now, We are at the moment just growing the services, growing accessibility services. And this is a general issue, this parasitic relationship between, about student services right around the world, I think. The last point is, accessibility services are treated with caution, almost suspicions, by faculty. So are they really the best advocate for UDL? I speak with good knowledge on this because for 4 years I was talking about UDL to faculty members who refused to see me as one of their own. Right, the fact I was actually doing a PhD and I was going to become faculty was totally ignored. Right, they really pushed it aside and they really saw me as a disability service provider. And equally now I'm a faculty, and just last week I did a talk on my campus within Mental Health Week on the use of UDL within to erode barriers for students who are suffering from mental health issues. And I had colleagues across the room who suddenly looked at me very weirdly as if I were different again. He's not faculty. Why is he talking to us about this, right? So you have this barrier, and we have to be very wary that if we put too much weight on disability service providers, we may actually get nowhere because the message is not going to get through. So we have to rethink all this. Right. How can we, you want solutions, right? We don't want just to highlight the problem. So what can we do? When I was in McGill, as I said, I remember we came back from another head conference, not the Irish one, the American one, and I was on a plane with some of my staff. We'd been doing this for about a year at that time. And we looked at each other and we thought, we can't actually carry on doing this unless we take a hard look at ourselves and we do UDL within our service as well. And so from that point onward, we went into what we call a one-year audit. And we looked at every single part of what we were doing as accessibility service providers, and we looked at it through a UDL lens. And that changed everything. That really revolutionized everything that we'd been doing within our office. So I encourage you to do the same, and maybe to take that lens and look at what you are doing to move away from some of the challenges that we've looked at. It's feasible. This has been published, by the way. You'll have it on the reference page. And I think it gives you some hints as to what we can do as accessibility services. Right, on to the second issue. Sorry again. This is fairly straightforward because we've already mentioned it a little bit. But I'm going to talk to you about silo mentality and territoriality. I think those are obvious points, but we'll just highlight some of the things. So stakeholders come from radically different backgrounds, right? Faculty feel they have a different background, different experience than accessibility services. But that's not just it, right? We're on campuses where everyone, depending on the units you are, instructional designers don't feel like faculty and they don't feel like accessibility services. There are other student services who don't feel they have the same lens and the same perspective as accessibility services. So put yourself back into this document that we've just been introduced, which says really a UDL approach has to be, campus-wide and systemic. But these people don't have the same background, right? So we're going to have to do a lot of work at working together and creating collaboration when sometimes collaboration hasn't existed. Faculty, that's just an observation. Faculty are not receptive to people who are not faculty talking to them about pedagogy. And I think that's going to be a huge hurdle in what we do moving forward. They have to hear it from their own. So we have to create some sort of advocates within faculty themselves who are able to talk to faculty about pedagogy, about design. And they don't really listen to instructional designs either, right? And the campuses where we have a teaching and learning unit, well, they don't listen to those people either. Because once they're there, they're student services, right? Or they're support services, they're not really faculty. So a great problem we have here. And I think higher education is generally rife with this silo mentality. If you look at your own, if you look at your own campus, you're going to quickly see that we are many parts put together under this umbrella of institution, but actually often the problem is really organizational. Is that we've never historically looked at ourselves as being this one organization. We are many units. Many campuses where you'll see 13, 14 faculties apart from all the different services, and people have a different mentality, different approach, different ethos. So a great issue with UDL work is we're going to have to break through that. Territoriality, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly to keep some time for questions as well. I'd say it goes beyond silo, right? I think because of this fragmentation, we are often struggling for visibility. We are struggling for some sort of prestige, to be the unit who has done that, the unit who has done that. We've adopted this business model in higher education, but the problem is it's also internal, right? So we have a business model internally. So each unit is actually competing with another. And this is going to be a great problem in UDL because someone is going to not necessarily want to collaborate because they're the ones pushing ahead, or they're the ones that really are the lead on this and are seen as carrying the flag and doing this. So it's going to create some issues too, and we have to be aware of these when we look at systemic campus-wide implementation. Issues of funding as well, right? Often, if you want to be, let's say you're on a campus where UDL hasn't happened, you want to choose a stakeholder, that's going to carry money, right? So people are going to be also fighting for, well, what are the funds attached to this? Does my unit have the funds? Does your unit have the funds? How are we sharing the funds? All sorts of things we have to think about. Pedagogy versus design thinking as well. This is going to be a huge problem because so far, everything about UDL, and it's been shown again and highlighted by the presenter just before with the policy document, everything about UDL is about design thinking. And we are not in a design thinking mode. Often institutions, if we're very lucky, we've got a couple of instructional designers who work with a couple of allies, but they don't really manage to reach other people in other departments. So how are we going to move an entire campus into this notion of design thinking? It's going to be fairly tough. Some solution, and I can only be hopeful here, and I'm not necessarily going to give you some very pragmatic tips, but interdisciplinarity, I think, is something we have to work towards. This notion that we are not working just with accessibility services if we are in that field. We're not just working with student services. We're not just, if we're faculty, working with faculty. But we have to redesign a 21st century approach to collaborative work where we are able to work in teams where there might be faculty, there might be accessibility services, there might be instructional designers, there should be students, and other services as far as registrar, people who are involved in other things as well, working within those teams. Mobility as well. I find it striking, as I said, that I've spent so long in accessibility services, I'm now labeled as being faculty. And whenever I want to walk over to accessibility services and say, let's do something together, right, again, you see the barriers and you see that, we can only perceive people in being in different positions. Create some mobility, right? Wouldn't it be great if faculty were seconded to working within accessibility, if people in accessibility were becoming, ambassadors within each faculty and working like this? And an overarching UDL UDL being embedded in an overarching, mission statement. That's important too, because often when people want to start these collaborative partnerships, they are looking for a message somewhere, right? They're looking for a validation in terms of senior administration saying, this is okay, this is good, you should be doing this. And often, if you look at your own campuses, you'll probably realize it's not there, right? UDL is absent still from anything. Even if you don't want to use the word UDL, look whether the word inclusion is even mentioned in your ethos or your mission statement. Right? Often it's not, and we have to work on that. Right, so hang on a minute. Thanks for bearing with me. So looking ahead, this is not the only problem that we have. I've identified two, but I wanted to mention others as well. Issues of over-personalization of on campus of a UDL-wide work. I've been sort of subject to that. You will often see that if you start a really systemic sort of initiative on UDL, the person who's doing that suddenly is labeled as the UDL guy, all right? And that's it. And people are quite satisfied, right? Let's bring in the UDL guy and he'll talk to us about this. But this goes nowhere, right? It's a huge burden, first of all, for the person having to carry that. And also moving forward, it becomes impossible to create a collaborative systemic implementation if we rely on the fact that, well, there's one person doing that. And then they carry that flag and that's what they have to do. Issues of strategic planning and sustainability. It's great that this policy document has come out, but often still, we're not going to see this being talked about in terms of what happens in 10 years, where do we want to be in 15 years, where do we want to be in 20 years, which is shocking because most institutions are starting to have strategic plan and it's still absent from that, right? And we're not going to be able to do this management of change process unless we still start seeing concrete objectives that we have to reach in terms of sustainability. And then issues of management of change. We're not great in higher education at doing management of change. So the problems we have here widely is we are bringing inclusion, we're bringing UDL as this huge change, but as institutions, we're not great at doing this management. So it's one issue of change amongst many others that we're not dealing great with. Issues of burnout as well. we have to be really careful. I mean, I was really lucky because I was working on a campus for 4 years. I knew I was leaving. Afterwards, I was going to get my PhD. I was going to go and become faculty. It made me very tenacious, right? I was able to do a lot of things because I knew there would be an end and I would move forward. But I don't know if I would have been able to do that if I'd been in it for life, if I was in the service for 10 years. Because I was dead tired when I finished after 4 years. It's extreme. There's a lot of energy. It's very big, massive. So we have to think about that as well, about sustaining our staff, sustaining our team, sustaining the collaborations that we're starting. So what I'd like to encourage you as a solution, just to finish off, because we have to move forward. So I think it's great that this policy document, one of the first in the world, I would say, that is actually talking about UDL in terms of multiple stakeholders, multiple perspectives. We're not even doing that on paper yet. So this is a groundbreaking document, and thank you very much for having published it. But I think we need to go even further than that, and we need to have a lens that enables us to move forward for the future. And something I'd like to, in concluding, I'd like to bring forward is that maybe a solution is to start thinking about UDL implementation in terms of ecology and ecological lens. So for those who are not familiar with it, what I mean by ecological lens is going back to Bonfenbrenner's sort of model, where typically, obviously he was a social worker and worked in education. Typically in the middle, you would have the child. This is normally why we use it in education. And then you realize that whatever the child is doing is not a manifestation of naturally of intent or deliberate sort of expression, but it's a reflection of the multiple systems that are around that person, and it could be the teacher too. So the multiple systems that are around that person and that interact and make everything very complex and mean that when we're seeing something in our classrooms, really, we're seeing the manifestations of multiple large systems. Well, now imagine, and this is done more and more in management, that in the middle there, it's not a child, but it's your stakeholder which is in charge of actually doing UDL implementation in your campus. Right? So I'd like to ask each of you to think, well, who's doing it at the moment in your campus? Is it accessibility services? Is it a senior administrator? Is it faculty, a faculty unit or teaching and learning unit? Imagine them in the middle, and then imagine all of the different systems that are actually interacting with that unit, right? And imagine the complexity that brings to the issue of UDL. I'm going to jump there and then come back to this slide. This is just, and I'm really bad at graphics, I apologize, it's disastrous. But but I wanted to give you some ideas, right, of the things that are in these systems that are around whatever stakeholder is in the middle and responsible for this. So let's start there. Institutional culture and history. No two campuses have the same culture and history. So if we jump ahead and say there's a model for UDL implementation, it's bound to not go right, because if you're talking, as I was before, on a campus of 50,000 students, right, which is literally a little village within the town, 4,500 faculty, and you look at how we're going to implement UDL there, and if you look at where I'm now, a campus of 5,000 students, 1,000 faculty, part-time and full-time, this is not the same problem. You're not tackling the same variables. This is going to have a huge effect on whichever that stakeholder is in the middle. Red tape, admin heaviness, and willingness to streamline. This is almost like the culture, but what's your administrative culture? Because some campuses are are open to change. They will move very quickly. They don't necessarily have a lot of red tape. They don't have these heavy processes. They will move much faster. Others may not be able to do that. Support from senior administration. We've talked about that already. Multiple competing stakeholders. We've talked about that too, right? You've got to look at the landscape. Who else is interested in taking this? Relationship with natural collaborators. If you're an accessibility service, I'm not sure you have many natural collaborators. There may be other units who may have more natural collaborators because they've been working at this for longer. Administrative strategic plan, right? Is there a sustainability policy in your university? When I was at McGill, one of the lucky things is we had a sustainability office that was designing a Vision 2020. And one of the first things I did as an accessibility manager is I linked up with them and we made this pact. I was able to create a partnership and we made this pact that every single strategic document looking at sustainability for 2020 was going to talk about accessibility and inclusion and possibly UDL. And in retrospect, and mutually, we would actually do the same. So every time we talked about UDL, we would talk about sustainability and we would talk about Vision 2020. So sharing the same language, right? And cross-referencing with our units what you're doing. This is going to be very important. Credibility with student body. We forget about that. And I encourage you to look at the end of these 2 days how often we talk about UDL, but we don't actually mention the students. They need to understand what we're doing as well on a campus. You know, you need to talk to the unions, student unions. You need to make them partners and actually make them understand. So whatever relationship is happening with the student unions is going to be important too. Issues of size and resources, we mentioned this. No two campuses are the same. External variables that are affecting all of your campus. So this may be government things. It could be funding envelopes. Things that is going to influence the way your own individual campus is going to be actually dealing with implementation. And we've seen how many countries are represented here. Those variables are not the same in every country, right? So I'm not sure we can look at higher education as one, but actually we have to look at really some of the specific variables. So if you go back to Bonfim-Brenner's ecological perspective, then imagine whoever's at the middle, and I give you a choice of that because I think it's still evolving. Different campuses have different recipes. Whoever's at the middle is going to have to be dealing with all of these different things. And that's where the ecological nature and complexity comes in. So let's go back to this now. One of the sad things is that I think, that's my take, but I think that it's going to be impossible to have a UDL blueprint that works for every single campus, right? So even when we accept that we need this multi-stakeholders, collaborative, move forward, we're not going to have one solution that you're going to be able to transfer like this to every single country and every single campus, every single country. So I think what we need to do as campuses is to actually do what I'd call a ecological mapping, like a blueprint. We need to stop, take the time to actually look at what are the variables that are going to influence our own UDL implementation, and then to react according to these variables and design a strategic plan and implementation plan that's going to actually be able to respond to the very individual, very specific variables that you're finding within your campus. In a way, you know that when we approach UDL within a classroom, the slogan, the general thought is one size does not fit all. What I'd like to encourage you to think is that when we're going to think about institutional implementation, it's going to be exactly the same. One size is not going to fit all, right? And I think it's extremely important that we take the time to reflect on this because we have been a little bit hasty, right? I was one of these people. I started doing these talks, almost say 8-9 years ago. I was all gung-ho. I was going to conferences. I was saying UDL is here, that's it. Now, we need to change. But we are too fast. All right? We're too fast within our own campuses because we're not taking the time to actually do this strategic mapping. And the problem of going too fast is that you burn out. How many institutions do you see that have started UDL implementation and have got completely stuck? All right? There was a great, there's a symposium in the US called UDL IRN, International Research Network, and they do a symposium every year, and I went to 2 or 3 years ago, and there was this great presenter who had a picture on the board, and it was base camp in the Himalayas, and so everyone was looking at it. He paused for a good 5 minutes, and he said, that's where we are, and we feel really, really happy about it, but look at the Himalayas behind and look at what's still ahead, right? So I would encourage all of you in your different campuses not to be too hasty in this second phase and to take the time to think about the complexity of what we're in. Because I'm very hopeful, I think it can be done, but I think we need to do a lot of reflections before globally and then individually as campuses, we just jump in and say, that's it, we're ready to do this. Okay, how are we doing for time? Good. So, consequences of this. I think there's really a pressing need for literature in this field. And unfortunately, even if you look today, and this is a high-level UDL conference, how often do we talk about management of change? How often do we draw from organizational literature to understand the complexity of what we're involved in? How often do we create collaborative partnership with people who work in management or who work in organizational change to try and look ahead at the things that we need to be able to counter resistance to change? These are all things that we need to do, and we've not been great at the moment. Just 1 minute, sorry. So I'm pumped up on sinus medication. It's really bad. And more than that, I think we have to start creating our own literature which tackles this issue. And there isn't any out there. I keep looking and there isn't. So you are the agents of change. I think we have to stop being satisfied with just talking about the benefits of UDL and why it's so great. People don't argue with that. people argue with the difficulties on terrain of why it's not happening, and that's where they give up as well, right? So I encourage you to go back to that ecological lens and take that with you as you go into your campuses, looking at the next 10 years, looking at the next 20 years. I put a few resources up there, and this is interesting, why the guy always finishes with a few resources. These are my top 7 picks of videos on UDL, but I'm going to give them to, and one of them is one of the ones that UNIT and McGill did. So I'm going to give them to you as a reading exercise tonight, well, a watching exercise, and watch them, and they're great. But think about how many of those actually tackle collaboration, multiple stakeholders, sustainability, strategic planning. I can give you the answer now. None of them do. All right, and this is where we're sort of stuck. So today's takeaway: driving implementation is not the same as introducing the appeal of UDL. I think I've tackled that one, but I'd like to take that one. You to take that one home with me. High-level strategic planning across campuses is required. I think, thankfully, with this document that we've seen today, we are now at the first step, and we've looked at the complexity. We've acknowledged the fact that it is not just on the shoulders of accessibility service providers, but we need to go further than that, and we actually need now to use that knowledge to look ahead and actually do that kind of strategic planning. Committed stakeholders are required and must take ownership. It's really tough. And I think there can be all sorts of confusion and rivalry and false starts if we are not clear from the start. I remember when I asked you the questions to the room, how many people had a clear vision of who was actually responsible, had ownership for that. And there were about 7 hands in the room. And we are probably the most committed personnel and practitioners in this field. So this is really a sort of, it begs a lot of reflection. Collaborative interdisciplinary leadership is required and must be nurtured. And I don't have the answer for you there. I'm not even sure how to do it. But if we don't succeed in achieving that, we are never going to be able to move this envelope forward, right? I don't want to scare you too much, but it's the enormity of the problem, because we are going to have to be frontier breakers in time of what comes next. An ecological mapping is required for its introduction. And that's my little addition, and it's something I've been advocating for and talking about for a long time. I've done a lot of consultancy with higher education institutions in Canada, and it's often where they get stuck, right? They call you in, your consultants, can you do 2 days with us and tell us how to move forward? And then I have to pause and say, actually, you can't do this, right? We need to take a lot more time to actually unpack all this and be able to actually see who's going to do what. Let's look at the variables of your own campuses. Let's look at the history of the culture and the size, the administrative procedures you have in place. And then once we have all this on that ecological mapping, then maybe you need a consultant. Then you need someone who can brainstorm from the outside and tell you this is a good recipe. I think this is going to work, right? Just I have a little bit more time before we go into questions. So something that, for example, that comes up here, I'm asked this all the time. Do we start, is it top down or is it bottom up? And that's a perfect illustration at how the ecological analysis is going to be important, because I actually honestly don't think there is one answer for every single campus. I've been on campuses where bottom up worked perfectly, and I've looked at other campuses where top down worked perfectly. And this depends on history, depends on size, depends on what personnel you already have there that already committed to this, but it's going to be extremely important. Top down could be an institution where you have that's very old, has a long tradition, is not really open to management of change, and then you are probably going to need a top down. You're going to need someone who actually from senior management who is able to embed this and force the moment down. Bottom up, I've seen departments where there was already your community of practice, there was a department that already had the lead, and then people very intelligently said, right, we've got experts here, they're faculty, they're committed to this, let's give them some leave, let's make them advocates about UDL into other departments, and that worked fine, right? So we're doing the same thing here. We're trying to move into a systemic embracement of UDL, but we're doing it in very different ways. And I think that's a perfect illustration of why you need to stop, why you need to pause, you need to look at the landscape, and then you're able to decide moving ahead how to create this multiple partnerships amongst all the key stakeholders that are mentioned in the policy document that we have today. So I think that's it. I've got some references up there. Yeah, I've been told this is available to you on the conference website, that you have access to this. I'll post them tonight on Twitter and LinkedIn as well if you want to look me up. So they'll be on SlideShare and you'll be able to access this. And now I believe we have about 10 minutes for questions, which is the UDL part, which is going to be the fun part.